my name is Blyth Barnow. I'm the Harm Reduction Faith Manager for Faith and Public Life. I'm based here in the Columbus area of Ohio. And my work usually is focusing on the racialized drug policy and the racist war on drugs that has cost too many people their lives and their freedom. But today we're going to be talking about this specific moment that we are in. After the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and too many others, we are seeing people take to the streets. And what we know is that this is a time when we are being called to deepen our moral imagination and believe Black realities that are being shared with us in this moment. This is particularly important for faith leaders, and it is particularly important for white faith leaders in this moment as well. This is a time to listen, trust, and follow the vision of Black leaders on the ground, knowing that it will lead all of us to holy ground. This is a time for us to repent the faith that we've lacked and truly come to believe that a new world is possible. A reminder for so many clergy, and it was a reminder that I needed myself earlier in last week, that to call for false peace in this moment is an act of betrayal and not solidarity. People on the ground need our assistance in this moment. They do not need our approval, and they certainly do not need our calls for restraint or our complicity in messaging from the state. I've been lucky to be able to be out in the streets in these last couple of days. It's been a profoundly moving, powerful, and spiritual moment for me. And I am lucky to be in deep partnership with local Black leaders here in the Columbus area that makes it clear how I am supposed to be showing up in this moment. And it is from that leadership that I'll be sharing some messages with you all today about how we collectively need to be positioning ourselves in this moment. We are hearing a lot about what's happening on the streets, but often we are focusing on things like words like violence and looting, when that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is a deep commitment to a new world being born, to the kingdom being born. I come from a Christian tradition, and that's the language I'm most comfortable with. So that's what I see happening. I see people coming together. I see people unifying in the body while in the streets. It's a powerful moment, and I hope that we all find our way to participate in it. And with that, I'll pass it on to Michael.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Vazquez. My pronouns are he, him. I am the Religion and Faith Director at the Human Rights Campaign, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. This week has been a monumental moment in the history of this country as we experience massive uprising across the country and across the world, where folks are crying out, demanding for the defense of the protection, the honoring of the dignity of Black lives, which have gone abused and terrorized throughout the entire history of this nation since its before its inception. Last Friday, just a week ago, the protests in DC kicked off with a peaceful march just up the street from me that marched down a major commercial area down to the steps of the White House. And there in Lafayette Square, the folks began to chant Black Lives Matter and demanding for justice for folks like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, who are just recent incidents of police violence, police brutality, murder at the hands of the state. These peaceful protests have continued and continue today. Folks are gathering throughout the day and late into the evening. But what we have seen in the face of these peaceful protests, what I've experienced as being on the front lines of these protests, of this demand for equity and for liberation and justice for the Black community, is to see the state respond with hyper-militarization, tear gassing and pepper spraying and shooting rubber bullets, chasing protesters through the street with with police officers mounted on horses, and the National Guard from several states being brought in from across the country to further militarize a peaceful protest. It's been one of the most these protests have been one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, and seeing such solidarity of folks of all different backgrounds gathering to demand justice for the Black community. But it's also been one of the most terrifying experiences, seeing how the president and the administration has weaponized and militarized the city, the district, in response to peaceful protests. I've seen myself experience the attack on Monday at St. John's Episcopal Church in Lafayette Square as we were peacefully protesting, and a photo op was desired, and so folks were shot at, folks were tear gassed, folks were beat and chased through the streets just so that a photo could be taken in front of a church. It is deeply, deeply disgusting what we have seen in response to what is simply a cry for the basic dignity of Black lives in this country. And so we commit ourselves as protesters, as organizers, as folks on the front lines, and folks organizing from home in whatever way is possible. We have committed ourselves to the defense of Black lives until that happens, whatever it takes for justice to come and for change to come. And so I'm grateful to share this space with Faith in Public Life today, to share some insight from the front lines and some training with you. And so I'll pass it back to Blyth to begin that training.
Thank you, Michael. So first, I just want to share some opportunities or food for thought about how people can be supporting in this moment. And as I kind of go through this list, I want to just name very clearly that this list is specifically talking to white clergy in this moment, white people of faith in this moment. So I'm just going to go through a quick list. One of the things that we can do in this moment, and is important for us to do in this moment, is to actually stop using words like violence, riot, or looting when we're discussing organizers and protesters. Instead, we should issue a statement condemning the ongoing violence and the ongoing excessive use of force by police departments, and demand that police and the National Guard stand down. We need to be clear in this moment about what justice means. Often people of faith call out for justice, but in this moment, we need to be specific about what justice means. Otherwise, we risk the chance of pacifying people of faith with feel-good words instead of calling them to action, which is what is needed in this moment. Justice in this moment means accountability for police officers who murdered Black people. Justice in this moment means defunding the police. Defunding the police is a faithful response to police violence. Defunding the police means that we correct the underinvestment in Black communities by correcting the overinvestment in policing. It means investing in the community and in community solutions. Another way to respond is to share organizers' demands with your congregation and schedule a time to discuss them, perhaps during your weekly prayer time. I think one of the things I've been hearing from faith leaders in particular is who's in charge? What are their demands? And I want to just name that these demands have been made very clear. And if you're confused about what the demands of your local organizers are, I encourage you to reach out and ask, because these demands are clear and that's what we need to be focusing on. For example, here are the demands from Minneapolis organizers. 1, to never again vote to increase police funding or to increase the police department's budget. 2, to propose and vote for a $45 million cut from MPD's budget as the city responds to projected COVID-19 shortfalls. 3, to protect and expand current investment in community-led health and safety strategies instead of investing in police. And 4, to do everything in our power to compel MPD and all law enforcement agencies to immediately cease enacting violence on community members. These are the demands. We need to keep them in mind in all that we do. Here are a couple other ideas. Use your church marquee to show public support for defunding the police. and lift up the life of George Floyd, as well as the names of those who have been murdered by police in your own city, town, or region. Another, use discretionary funds to contribute to local bail funds to support people's freedom. Another, schedule pastoral care calls with members in your congregation who are Black. Ask how you and the church can support them in this moment. Additionally, if you pastor a church near a mobilization, please avoid insinuating that your building needs protection from protests, and certainly do not call the police and notify them if organizers are nearby. That building is not your church. Your church is in the streets demanding justice. Another, consider increasing your hospitality in this moment. Ring your bells if you have them. Invite organizers in to rest, get some water, charge their phones, use the restroom, wash out their eyes, get a sandwich, get fresh PPE. Or offer your building as a medic site or a meetup point for organizers if they get separated. Or allow organizers to park in your parking lot. Think about how the physical space you have can be of benefit in this moment. If you are going to be out at demonstrations or you're going to open your doors, it is really important in this moment that you wear a mask and you follow recommended health protocols. So have extra masks on hand. Let me tell you, it's been a long week. And when you have those extra masks, go around and particularly tell white people to put them on. This is something that I've done out in protests. I bring extra masks. If I see a white person without a mask, I simply hand them a mask and tell them to please put it on. I also have other masks, and if I see a person of color without a mask on, I simply ask them if they want a mask. That's the decision that I've made as a white person and how to approach that. But it is critical in this moment that we're protecting our movement leaders as much as possible. And we know that COVID has been particularly devastating to Black communities. Other opportunities, ask your congregants to purchase items needed by medics like water, face masks, Ziploc bags, aloe vera, chemical, cold compacts, and other first aid supplies, and then deliver them to medics. Another, use your sermon to show scriptural support for organizers and the demands. The Bible is a justice text, use it as such. Another, call elected officials. We know that clergy has extreme social capital in our communities. How are we leveraging that in this moment? If you have a personal relationship with elected officials, please call them and ask for a meeting to discuss the demands of local organizers and ask that they be implemented. And invite local organizers to join that call or meeting with you. Also in this moment, it's important to keep our focus on police violence and not only violence against protesters. We have the tendency to sometimes stray into more generalized messages, but this moment is not about social justice generally. It is about justice for Black people in the face of racist violence by police specifically, and we must stay on message. Another thing that we have seen nationally and locally is that it is so important that we not let ourselves meaning faith leaders and faith communities, be used against organizers and protesters and Black people in general. We have seen the way that politicians have used our holy sites as a prop to incite further violence or to condone complete apathy. We have also seen here locally the way that media has focused on clergy and used us as to say, people downtown were violently demonstrating, but look at this other way, and have shown clergy standing peacefully. Don't allow yourself to be used that way. If a media representative or if press is running stories like that, reach out to them and ask for them to print a rebuttal, or retraction is the better word. It's important that we are in solidarity and we're not being used against others. If you're white, another important way to plug in this moment is to join organizations like SURGE, which stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice, or another organization doing explicit anti-racist work with white people. And I would encourage you to do this instead of starting your own initiative from scratch. These are organizations that are already well plugged and in deep accountability to communities of color, and we should be putting our funding there. Another message that I wanted to pass on that a colleague shared with me this morning is that when we're hearing, particularly white clergy, when we're hearing people say, talk to your people and don't stay silent, that means that we are supposed to be talking to our people about how George Floyd was murdered by white police. We're meant to be talking about systemic racism and the need to defund the police, not to just talk about how we feel about racism or just commit to not being racist. Taking responsibility for dismantling white supremacy starts with self. And if white folks want to speak up and commit to not being racist or dismantling white supremacy, that should come with a commitment to start with ourselves and our community. It should come with a commitment to action. And also in that, also shared is that we need not make a big display of it, and really, have a moment of prayerful reflection. If you're feeling the need to share the ways that you are participating in this moment really publicly, just consider whether you're sharing that to bring more people into this moment, or you're sharing to get personal validation and recognition. It is possible for us to speak up without taking over or leading. We have Black leaders in the streets right now who are doing that for us. And with that, I'll pass it to Michael.
Thanks, Blythe. I'm going to talk a little about what it looks like to show up to the protest, particularly for white folks, whether you are a person of faith or a faith leader looking to participate in these protests. And so before I get into some of the specifics, I want to share a little bit about an experience I had just a couple days ago. Don't ask me which day it was. Everything feels like a blur right now. I showed up a few days ago to the demonstration outside of the White House in Lafayette. At this point, we'd been pushed back pretty significantly up 16th Street in DC with little access to the actual Lafayette Square. And as I was walking up, this was around 6 in the evening, there was the sound of music coming from a loudspeaker. And often music is a part of protest. That is a beautiful part of protest. It's the diversity of tactics, tools, and art forms used. And so I wasn't really sure until I got closer when I realized that it was a couple of white evangelicals who had shown up and started blasting white worship music, Christian contemporary music, drowning out the sounds of protesters. This was an incredibly frustrating experience for me as a theologian, as a faith leader, as a person of faith, to witness the way that white folks had shown up and made the protest about themselves and centering on themselves, on their faith, on their needs as white people, instead of focusing on what is critical about these protests, the narrative that we are declaring and speaking, which is that Black lives are under attack, and we must do everything to protect Black lives. And so I had a conversation with these folks, and it did get heated, and I will work through what de-escalation tactics look like in a little bit, but continue to talk to them, and other folks in the crowd then engage with them and ask them to turn their music off. They refused. They lowered it a bit. It was still drowning out the sound of protesters. Eventually they did leave. Why I want to tell the story is that this is common, right? Not necessarily loud worship music being used, but what is common is that oftentimes folks, particularly white people of faith or faith leaders, show up to the protest line and make it about themselves in some capacity, in some way. And so the most important thing for white folks who want to show up to the protest, before you think about anything else, before you leave your house, is that you check your ego. That's the most critical thing as a white person showing up to a protest. What my dear friend and trained experienced trainer and organizer and activist, Michelle Higgins, Reverend in St. Louis, who's been in this work her whole life, often talks about that a low ego increases the capacity for impact. And it is true, right? Like when you show up as again, specifically as a white person, and you make the protests about you in some way, right? You want to center attention around you. You want folks to listen to you. Clergy especially, I love you, but you're used to being the center of attention and being heard, right? This is a space for you to come and listen, a space for you to come and learn, and a space for you to come and support the needs of organizers and activists, specifically Black leadership on the front lines. And so you need to check your ego before you leave your door. Before you show up, you need to analyze, why am I going to the protest? What are my motivations? And are those motivations going to be a hindrance to the narrative that is being woven about the threat, the real lived threat to Black lives across this country? And do what you need to do to put your ego in a box, like put it away, lessen your ego. Ego isn't inherently bad, but an overinflated ego creates risk the protest line, right? What happens when you show up to the protest with an ego that is rooted in your white privilege, in your particularly for Christian folk, in Christian supremacy, is that attention goes to you. It diverts attention from Black leadership, and that is a risk. That is a liability for the protest. And so what we need you to do is to look at what resources can you provide as a spiritual leader on the front lines, right? What can your congregation provide, whether that's bringing some food, whether that's bringing, like Blyth mentioned PPE, but bringing that to the line, right? Like look at what resources you have available and take a position of a servant and not the position of a leader. Oftentimes, right, clergy love, I've seen this, right, and this is my warning, right, is that clergy can show up and want to take a photo, right, like they also, like, there's a tendency to want a photo op, right, whether that's being photographed being arrested, photographed being at the front of the line. We need you to take up less space so that more space and attention can be devoted to Black leadership. That's the most critical thing for white folks showing up, clergy folks showing up on the line. The second thing I would ask of white clergy who are willing and able to show up to the protest is to stay when it gets ugly. The daytime, right, tends to be safer for protesters to peacefully protest. There tends to be less altercations that are incited by police, or in the case of places like DC, the National Guard and other militarized forces, they tend to not incite as much violence against protesters during the day as they do later into the evening. Doesn't mean it's not impossible, doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? Earlier this week, there were some clergy who were there. The sun was out. It was around 6 p.m. when we were getting tear gas at St. John's. And so it's not that it's not possible. But what we want, what I would love to see, and what I've heard others on the front line share, is that we need to see that white folks are willing to stay when it gets ugly, stay when it gets difficult, stay when security forces are inciting violence and attacking protesters. That is where we need your visibility, not when it's convenient, not when it looks cute, not when it's pretty, not when there's a nice space for a photograph and you can go home and there was no risk. But when things get difficult, when things get ugly, that is when we need your support, right? And this is when questions about de-escalation and spiritual care and responding to the trauma of the protest line are really important. The role of spiritual leaders can be really rooted in helping to de-escalate the police, de-escalate other security forces on the line, and to help protesters who are responding to the real lived trauma of the protest line when they are being attacked, whether that's the psychological warfare of just military presence or the physical attacks, whether through tear gas, rubber bullets, etc. Your role as a de-escalator, again, begins before you leave your house and you checking your ego. You can't help de-escalate someone else if you can't de-escalate yourself. And so you need to be aware of where your anxieties are, what your triggers are, and have an action plan for de-escalating yourself, lowering your anxiety, lowering, limiting your panic response to any of the many triggers that exist on the protest line. Checking in with yourself, whether that's breathing exercises before you leave and after you leave, the general self-care that you do when you're not on the protest line, and then checking in with yourself when things are calm on the line, so that when you see police escalating, when you see security forces inciting violence, you stand between protesters and those security forces, and you begin to have a conversation with them to help them de-escalate. While it's not, the general rule is no longer that police won't attack clergy. It is, like, again, like I've said, like we've experienced this week, security forces will at times defer to you more than to a protester. So it's important that you put yourself in front of protesters to protect them. Use your physical body and use all of your pastoral skills to de-escalate security forces by having a conversation with them, asking them to back down, knowing what protest rights are, and telling them to reduce the violence that they're inciting and to bring an end to that violence. That's your main responsibility. And again, don't show up at the front of the line to bring attention to yourself, right? It's still valuable and necessary, particularly in de-escalation, to have your collar or other religious insignia on, but don't show up to the front to bring attention to yourself. Show up to the front to help de-escalate and to reduce violence on the line incited by security forces. And with that, I will pass it back to Blyth.
Thank you so much, Michael. So much wisdom. I wanted to close our time together with this quote that I have found to be very poignant, very meaningful for us today. And it is by Ricardo Levin Morales and was contributed to a conversation with Showing Up for Racial Justice in 2015. Ricardo says, "White people are taught that racism is a personal attribute, an attitude, maybe a set of habits. Anti-racist whites invest too much energy worrying about getting it right, about not slipping up and revealing their racial socialization, about saying the right things and knowing when to say nothing. It's not about that. It's about putting your shoulder to the wheel of history, about undermining the structural supports of a system of control that grinds us under, that keeps us divided even against ourselves, and that extracts wealth, power, and life from our communities like an oil company sucks it from the earth. The names of the Euro-descended anti-racist warriors we remember, John Brown, Ann Braden, Miles Horton, are not those of people who did it right. They are of people who never gave up. They kept their eyes on their prize, not their anti-racism grade point average. This will also be the measure of your work. Be there. There are things in life we don't get to do right, but we do get to do them." And so as we discern how to respond to this moment, how to show up in this moment, let us remember that we may not get it right, but we do need to get into the work. And with that, we'll close our time together and know that you are all being held in prayer as you discern your place in this movement, and that as you show up under the leadership of Black leaders in the street. Thank you.